Same mood. And before going to the first panel discussion and meeting, I'm offering to see a very small video reel now again. The new reality is being formed, the reality of the new millennium, the new world of vast opportunities. The borders don't mean anything anymore, for it's only 1 hour of travels to another edge of the world. There are lots of opportunities and even more. So come into the right time, because the progress will not wait for you. The approaches are being improved, the new standards are being implemented, and new forms of work on future is the key for the new knowledge. It's not worth to stay aside and to look only one direction. The world around us is not only in front of our eyes. It's time to broaden our knowledge, to broaden the horizons, to analyze, to get to know about the future. Each one who sees him or herself in the world of opportunities is a leader. He is ahead. He knows the world behind his shoulders. Experience. It is invaluable. The knowledge is limitless, and the willingness to get perfection is the main stimulant. You are the new element in the movement. You are here because you know. You are here because you want to know more. You are here because your opinion is worth attention. We are the leaders. We are moving the world ahead. Forward, we are changing. We are ready to take the new ones. We are ready to not to use any inefficient actions and to leave our weaknesses behind us for the sake of the future. We know how to do that. So today in this hall there are lots of people who know how and are following closely all the changes which are going on in the world, and you could see how many shakes our world has overlived during the last years. Unexpected election win of Donald Trump in the United States of America, and even more unexpected Brexit. Lots of refugees from Syria which overwhelmed the Europe, and honestly awful terroristic acts, and the problems of the employment is still big, and the epoch of oil dollars is already here. We are feeling the climate change problem in our cities, so we are coming close to the conclusion that we are at the edge of the new economic reality. The old laws are not working, but we need to invent the new ones. So today the brightest heads are trying to find the new recipes, the new ways. So during those 2 days we'll try to discuss that at the Kyiv International Economic Forum. So today we're beginning our first meeting with the topic Global Challenges of the New Economic Reality. So I'd like to invite now the participants of this panel discussion. I will introduce them, so I'll ask them please come up to the stage. So, Mr. Graeme Maxton, Secretary General of the Rome Club, please. He's the critic of the modern economic thinking and the author of one of the best business books bestseller. Rajendra Kumar Pachauri, please, the Nobel Prize winner for 2007, the president of the World Forum on Sustainable Development. During 13 years he was the head of the interstate group of experts which researched the climate change. Mr. Peter Wagner, please, the head of the Group of Support of Ukraine of the European Commission and the Director General. Mr. David Al-Shazavi, the President of Annual Investment Forum in Dubai. And also we'll have here Maxim Nefedov, who is the Deputy Minister of Economical Development and Trade of Ukraine. So, before we begin, or in the beginning, I'd like to ask one short question for all of you, and I would ask you one by one to give a short response for it. In your opinion, what's out of the latest world events influenced most of all onto the global economy of the world? Please. Mr. Maxton, please.
Gosh, thank you, first of all, for giving me the chance to be here. It's a great pleasure to join you today. That's a very challenging question to begin. I think the biggest short-term challenge is probably a political challenge. We're facing a time where the world has a number of very major challenges, economic challenges, social challenges, and we have a political system which is failing to address those. If you look at some of the issues that you mentioned, like the election of Donald Trump or Brexit, this is taking us into a direction which makes dealing with the challenges of inequality and climate change much more difficult. So I think the biggest challenge I see is a political challenge.
Mr. Pachauri, please.
Very much. Yes, I think we're facing a number of challenges, but I would say right on top comes the challenge of climate change. The IPCC, which I had the privilege of chairing for 13 years, came out with a special report in 2011 about the impacts of climate change, particularly in the form of extreme events. We have seen a large number of extreme events in recent weeks, and I think unless we change direction, unless we start mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases and adapting to the impacts of climate change with a sense of urgency, I'm afraid whatever economic progress we make in several parts of the world will be wiped out by the impacts of climate change. So I would say that is today the #1 challenge, and I think all of us, including this beautiful country, must treat it as an important part of economic policy.
Thank you.
From the Brussels perspective, I would clearly see that we will have the challenge to keep our societies and markets open within EU, within Europe, but worldwide as well. And I think for Brussels, the big challenge will be for the EU how to organize the EU in view of forthcoming Brexit, in view of all the international events, and along the lines as inter alia set out by President Juncker recently in the State of the Union speech. I think this question of how the European Union, but Europe also, the wider Europe, are presenting and organizing themselves within these wider challenges, I think that is crucial for us.
Thank you very much. I think the economic challenge basically is the main challenge where basically it's related to the oil price internationally as well as basically to the international growth of many countries, and this has an impact basically on the social living as well as basically taking care of poverty in a lot of countries as well as the climate changes, as my colleague said.
Thank you. So all of you are saying that the challenges are rather huge and they exist, but the question is whether we are ready to perceive them, whether we are ready to overcome them, to counteract those challenges. The interesting precedent of the latest year, when the president of the US, Donald Trump, claimed that America will come out of the Paris Climate Convention. Later, the White House said that it won't happen, so last week, Press Secretary Tillerson said that maybe the US will stay in this decree, but still the precedent exists. What's more important, the economic growth, the comfort, or the fight against a huge, but still not that comprehensible threat hazard for the people? So I'd like to ask Mr. Pachauri, like an expert in climate change. Multiple times you've mentioned that those change will touch everyone, but how can we let the people know? How can we show the people some of the precise steps for them to see that you can counteract climate change? How can we change the thinking of the leaders, both political and economic?
I think that's an extremely useful question, and I think the only way to bring about change is to create grassroots awareness. I've started a program called the POP movement, which stands for Protect Our Planet. And I believe it's the youth of the world who have to take the lead. Every school, every college, every university must become a center of action to deal with climate change. And I'm not talking about only climate change, but moving in a direction that is sustainable. apart from the Paris Agreement, we also have today with us the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. His Excellency, the Prime Minister talked about the initiatives being taken in Ukraine. I think this country has a unique opportunity by which you could also get benefits in terms of energy security, which is a very important objective for economic development in this country. So I would say the place to start is with the youth. We need to create awareness among them because their minds are fresh. They are willing to take the challenge of change, and I think they have to assume leadership. Otherwise, it's their future which is at stake. So if you do that, there'll also be pressure on politicians and leaders because youth have enormous power in terms of influencing the thinking of adults in their homes, outside their homes. So I would place that as an important challenge that all of us must accept.
Thank you, Mr. Pachauri. Mr. Maxton, would you please tell? The topic of climate change was one of the chapters of the book, of your book you wrote. You were co-author of this book, so in this book you're saying that the real ways to success of the developed countries and the countries which are just developing, I think that the latter is Ukraine, those are different ways. But maybe there are some of the universal receipts. Would you give a piece of advice?
First of all, I must agree completely with what Professor Pachauri has just said. And the Club of Rome, which has known about this problem, about the risk of climate change for more than 40 years, is now doing exactly the same thing. We've started our initiative to educate young people. We had our first ever summer academy in Italy a few weeks ago, and we brought lots of young people together to teach them about climate change and to teach them about the economic system which is causing this problem, because it's the economic system that is the cause of climate change. And that, I think, goes back to the question about how do countries develop. And the book that I wrote with Jürgen Randers looks at how to reform the economic system in the rich world. Now, there's no need for growth. We have enough of a big enough economy in the rich world already. We do not need any more economic growth. And so this whole mentality that we need growth in the world is something that we need to change. But for the poor world, we do need economic development. But what we must not do is increase the ecological footprint. We must be able to bring a higher standard of living to people without increasing the carbon footprint and the ecological footprint. And that's really the way we need to rethink our economic system in the poor world, so that we can improve well-being and standard of living, but not increase the amount of CO2 we pump into the atmosphere.
Mr. Al-Shazavi, would you please tell which ways do you see to build, to construct the new economic reality?
I agree with my colleagues, but my point of view, it's a little bit, maybe it's a different approach. I would believe basically innovation is the way forward for most of the economies basically to develop their countries. If you would like me to subscribe it, basically I would say basically sustainability, it's very important to build the future cities as well as basically the sustainable and smart cities. And these sustainability cities and smart cities will not come except through innovations. Innovation in many areas, either it's economic areas as well as basically environmental areas and the social areas. And all of this combination of innovation in environmental as well as economic as well as social area, it will bring the happiness to the society. And today, basically, if we don't have a happy society, and that's going to be basically undeveloped countries, and we would like to basically emphasize on the innovation of basically youth, innovation of technologies, innovation of countries, and I think all of that will lead to a new generation of collaboration between countries. The lackness of basically collaboration today is creating undeveloped countries. So I believe basically we really need to focus on innovation, which basically, turns the business to more of a collaboration between countries.
Thank you. Mr. Wagner, how can those ways of dealing, of solutions, are relevant for Ukraine? Because we are speaking that Ukraine is only a developing country on its way of development, but today we can see lots of criticism from the EU about the reforms which are not going in the right way. Well, of course, there are some appraisals, because since the times of Revolution of Dignity we've done a lot, but still we can hear this criticism. So are those recipes relevant for Ukraine? And maybe what are the spheres of collaboration between Ukraine and EU in this direction, can you see?
I would say that there's still, for sure, at the moment, still much more recognition and praise for the enormous reform efforts in this country than criticism, or maybe rather skepticism. Sometimes at the moment there are some question marks. Where does the country intend to go from now, after really having gone through extraordinary transformations? It's something that maybe too many people, notably outside Ukraine, take for granted, but maybe also within Ukraine, many people do not fully see and understand how much actually has already been changed, even if a lot still has to be done. From our perspective, therefore, it's definitely not about criticism, it's not about lecturing, but it is, of course, about continuing to offer support, and to offer support notably, and that is this kind of, I don't know whether you want to call it a recipe. We have, with the association agreement and then the related deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, a roadmap how to bring Ukraine closer to the EU, and that will strengthen Ukraine, that will strengthen the EU. And what is now so challenging is that I saw some representatives of what we call new member states in the EU who have gone through similar processes, because at the end of the day, what you're doing with the association agreement is you're preparing the country to getting as closely as possible integrated into the EU market, and therefore also opening for the international market. And I think this is the openness, one of the words which the Prime Minister used. It's the fair and open business, and it's this fair and open trade that we need between the two blocks, between everybody here. And that is for us the challenge. And when it comes to Ukraine, we really stand ready to continue supporting these efforts. These efforts are now, unfortunately, much more tedious than the much more headline-grabbing issue of cleaning up a banking sector, bringing down inflation. There are many, many things which have been done, and now you have to bring legislation in line with our legislation. And that is where innovation comes in. I think for the country, it has to really go through this innovation push. It has to become more open. And for us, it is therefore on the institutional side where we think that there's still a lot to happen, because business inter alia very much look at what are the opportunities. And for us, it is really innovation on the legislative side. On the side we are defining our relations. You saw the State of the Union speech recently. EU is trying to organize and strengthen, consolidate itself internally, while at the same time strengthening the relations with its neighborhood and trying to play a stronger role on the global stage. And in these processes, Ukraine is a big, important, and very positive partner, and definitely not a partner where the relations are mainly determined by criticism.
Mr. Al-Shazavi, Ukraine today is trying to find new spheres, new markets, new worlds. And this year, it seems to me, it's the first time when we took part in the investment forum in Dubai. So I'd like to ask you about your impressions. Sir, please. I'm sorry, because Maxim Nefedov, who is Deputy Minister of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine, joined us. Maxim Nefedov here, thank you. So, I'm sorry. So, I will repeat my question. So, this is the first time when Ukraine took part in the investment forum in Dubai. What are your impressions of this partnership? And what's the most interesting perspective, the most interesting sphere which could be useful for both sides, taking into consideration the new challenges we are facing in the global world?
Question. I would like to basically emphasize that during the participation of Ukraine in the annual investment meeting, we focused on creating the partnership between Ukraine and different countries. And the platforms that we provide during the annual investment meeting, which takes place in Dubai every year in April, we connect more than 145 countries together. And the reason basically we do that is to attract foreign direct investments to different countries. The foreign direct investments today, basically, it gives a competitive opportunities to different countries to look at. Today, we give you a model of United Arab Emirates and Dubai, where basically the government itself is becoming very competitive, very transparent government, very innovative government, where basically it creates works and opportunities for the local market as well as for international markets. So basically, it's an opportunity that basically we create as a government of UAE as well as private sectors, to encourage the private sectors to take any initiatives of the government initiative to change it to basically a business opportunity. Now here, I believe Ukraine and other countries, basically, they can benefit from this partnership between the Arab countries and the Gulf countries, as well as basically the surrounding neighbors, to create this partnership. We, again, emphasize on two things: the innovation and the youth. The innovation, I always say a word which is very famous: get the technology before the technology gets you. And today, I believe, any country doesn't innovate its business, it will be behind. And before innovating, also, you have to fix a lot of rules, a lot of legislation, and you have to fix the government. The management style in the government has to fix to basically create that. So I believe today we have gained the confidence in the international market as a platform for real FDI as well as business collaboration. So we are used as a hub. So today I believe, Ukraine can basically come and learn, and our doors are open basically, for a lot of knowledge transfer as well as more of a partnership, collaboration between our country and any other countries.
Дякую, пане Аль-Шазаві. Я прочитала, до речі...
Thank you, Mr. Al-Shazavi, and I have read a very interesting statistics. Ukraine exports to the Gulf countries black metals, 35% of all of the export. The grains, 34.7, almost 35% of the export. So basically 7% of all of the export, it goes like a product export. And I think that Ukraine, like the strong countries, see Ukraine only as a product supplier. And I would like to address this question to the representative of Ukrainian government. It seems like we're very dependent on the situation on the product markets. And if something happens, if the changes happen on the product markets, then the new currency or economic crisis might await for Ukraine. Whether we have the plans how to get rid of the dependency. Thank you. By the definition, Ukraine is an open economy where the export is a big part of the GDP. And we do understand that the main spheres for our exports, they are based on the main competition advances of Ukraine. And we have a lot of sources for the iron ore. We have really good soils, the agricultural soils, and we have the possibility to use this for the grain growing and using the new technology. So saying that we have to be ashamed of this part of Ukrainian business, then I do not agree with that. I actually think that we have to build up absolutely contemporary, technologically developed economics in these spheres where we can give the main tempo and in the world, as our agrarians are already doing. In the agricultural sectors, the first so-called unicorn companies, the companies of worth more than $1 billion, appear in Ukrainian agricultural sector. And I would like to agree with my colleagues that the business, they have to keep on moving forward in the spheres also. What the government copes with, what we care about, and what is one of the main priorities is the diversification of economics. We don't need just the more of grains or metal. We need more spheres of development. We have to create the conditions for the development of the machine construction. A lot of people do not know that our exporting goods, number one, to Germany, for example. These are the components for the cars. And we have to develop the conditions for the IT development. The IT grows in 2 digits every year. And For the last 5 years, it's almost triple more in development than before. And Ukraine, again, exporting the IT services in the topmost categories of Ukrainian exports. We have to double our efforts in all of the spheres that we have the great potential under, and we have to broaden the geography of our exports, and we have to broaden the variability of our exports, and of course it's going to make us less dependent on the economical cycles. Mr. Maxwell, what do you think on the economics what do you think of economics that is oriented on the exporting of products, and what would you recommend to the representatives of Ukrainian government, taking into consideration the challenges of the modern world?
I think there's a need for a note of caution here. Without wanting to be controversial, we've got into our heads a number of ideas about the economic system which are fundamentally wrong. That economic growth is good, that it reduces inequality, that it reduces poverty. And we have the same idea with trade. For the last 30 years, we've been told that trade and openness is good. But actually, if I look at the countries that I travel to around the world, if I go to Southeast Asia, or I go to Africa, or I go to Latin America, you see a lot of countries adopting the Western model of economic development with open markets, but it doesn't mean they're able to compete in anything other than resource extraction. That you can sell your resources because there are lots of people who want to buy it, the rich countries, but to compete economically on anything that requires economies of scale with open markets becomes almost impossible. I was in Indonesia a few months ago, and they would like to develop an automotive industry or a chemicals industry or a steel industry, and they can't do that because of open markets. So I think we've got into our head the idea that complete openness is good, and I think that's something we need to rethink, that we need to have balance in our openness of trade so that other countries, poorer countries, can actually develop the economic foundations for future development and not just have their resources taken over a period of maybe 20 years. So I think we need to rethink this whole idea about openness to trade.
Yes, I would like to add to that. I really think we need to redefine the very composition of economic growth. And I think what Mr. Maxton has said is absolutely right. If you have economic growth that's going to damage the ecology of this planet, that's going to create a higher level of climate change, then clearly that growth has to be reoriented. It was Mahatma Gandhi who said, speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. So what's the point of saying that we are growing at 7% or 8% if in actual fact you're damaging the very basis for which human existence, the very basis on which human existence is dependent. I would submit that in the case of Ukraine, for instance, innovation is extremely important, and perhaps what you need innovation most fundamentally is in the energy sector. I happen to be chairman of an organization called the Energy Farm International Foundation, and we have a project here funded by the Norwegians on using biomass for creating heat and electricity. Now, this is a country which has a substantial amount of renewable energy resources, and I think if we could innovate and if we could spread that innovation on a large scale, you would not only be able to help in reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide in the future with economic growth, and at the same time, you'd be able to provide jobs. You'd also be able to make sure that you have a higher level of energy security. And I think that, to my mind, is an extremely important objective for this country. So I think we need to redefine the directions in which we go in the future. We don't have to necessarily emulate the so-called countries which have pursued the path of economic growth as is considered successfully. But we need to redefine how this country and other countries should grow in the future.
Thank you, and I would like the speakers to be a bit closer to the microphone because we can't hear you properly. But then again, in order to move forwards, we have to find the solutions for the main problematic zones that exist nowadays. And I have another question to the Deputy Minister. on the data of the ministry that you're working on, the level of the shadow economy in the first quarter of this year is 37%. And in 2010, it was 38%. And it's a very dramatic figure, because if you speak about the shadow economy, nothing has changed, nothing has been done. Why is it so? How should we keep on working forwards? You know, Ukraine traditionally has a quite big share of the shadow economies, as the so-called southern countries do. And we do understand that it's connected to the distrust of the citizens to the government and business, and the general mutual distrust between these shareholders. And it prevents the economical increase, of course, and economical growth, but then again it creates a lot of opportunities if we will be able to get this economics out of shadow. It is hard to do that because we have this economical and security problems we're facing for the last years. But I think that the government still has done a lot of not very popular steps, but that are very important to give the people the stimuli not to be pushed off, but to voluntarily leave the shadow zone and to get incorporated into the so-called white economics. For what I can recall, we've had almost twice reduced the taxation on the labor that we've provided in 2015, and this this law gives Ukraine the opportunity to be one of the most competent, gives the competitive advance among the countries of the region. The increasing of the level of the salaries, of the basic salaries in Ukraine, now it gives the equal, like a lot of Ukrainian heads of the factories that can only receive the minimum wage. We do understand this untruth. So the increasing of the minimum level of the salary is also the moment that helps us to improve the white economics. And the pension reform that has been approved by the parliament and implemented by the parliament 2 days ago, this is one of the main aims for us to get the situation going further into the white economics. It's a very slow process. We would really want it to be, not to be pushing people to get into it, not through the checks of the execution and law enforcement bodies, but we have to create the stimulus for the people and for the entrepreneurs, for this economics to work in the white field, work officially and legally. We have to create the corresponding legislation frame, because if the state does nothing to meet the interests of the business, we have to create the rules and regulations from the state to give them the maximum best conditions. So we can take this from the statesman, this leverage that you can pull up or pull down, leaving him no field for the corruptions and threats. In these spheres we have done a lot also. We've taken down hundreds or even thousands regulation acts for providing the administrative. We've made a lot of administrative services into electronic way. We know it's not enough yet. We're working on it. We want to have this reform cabinet of ministers. We're cooperating with the parliament quite closely. And I'm really pleased to say that now we are working on the big law on the easiness of the business. And if we're going to implement this new project on business, then we're going to get 35 positions higher in the international ratings. And I am quite sure that all of this complex action are going to create the conditions and the platform that are going to give the business the opportunity to get from the grey shadow economy to the white economy. Mr. Wagner, but how the Europe sees it, how the Europe sees all of these tryouts of the change in Ukraine, because the EU is one of the key donors of our reform processes, and what we hear quite frequently, that the main thing is not about the amount of the money that are given, but about the efficiency of the usage of this money. Whether it is used efficiently now, the money that EU donates into Ukraine, and whether all of the mechanisms are being used, or maybe there are some directions between the EU and Ukraine that can be useful for the further development.
Very important question to be asked, because indeed we are very often saying it's not necessarily only the money and the amounts that are available, it's the way what we're doing and how we are doing it. But allow me to go one step back. We are a good way into this discussion. about the future of Ukraine, the current situation, and we have, Maximum said the word security, we have not said that this is a country at war. Now, obviously this is not for this panel a distinctive element of the discussion. Good. On the other hand, we see in daily life and in our interaction with Ukrainian politicians that more and more of the actions are justified and explained also against the background of the war. So probably the two positions are a bit extreme, and we are in reality somewhere in the middle. But the war is something that is decisive for this country, and is decisive for the kind of support that we are giving, which starts at the political support, which has nothing to do with money, because ensuring and recalling the need for the integrity of the country is a key, one important element. Secondly, again, also before going then into the question of what's the money and how to use it, I think for the country it is crucial, and thank you, Maxton, for referring to parts of it, because from a European perspective, if health systems, if social systems, if the pensions aren't fixed, and we are not only talking about the budgetary impact of that, but about the social impact, about the question of do people have the impression this is an inclusive society where there is some progress for everybody or only wealth for few. I think if we don't get these things fixed, all the economic discussions, be they at the global level of climate change, be they at the local level of more or less regulation, will always remain incomplete. And that's why for us, I said earlier on, we have, in our understanding, a partnership agreement, and that's the association agreement which covers many of these areas. And for us, it is very important that one moves on all these fronts in parallel. And let me recall one where definitively, when it comes to the efficiency, we see room for improvement. And that is when it comes to justice, when it comes to the fight against corruption. President Juncker was very clear a few weeks ago at the annual summit with the heads of states and governments here, when he recalled that so much has been done, but we in Brussels, the EU, is still to some degree unhappy with where we are in the fight against corruption. And this is not only some bureaucrats sitting there and being unhappy with drafts law they are seeing. Have a look at the latest figures from the World Economic Forum when it comes to the question of how well does business perceive the protection of its property. And there are very, very few countries in the world where the situation is worse. And an investor will always make the question of going somewhere dependent, of course, entirely on the question, is my property safe? Are the institutions reliable with whom I am working? That's why I'm stressing this so much. It's not only a Brussels obsession with governance, it's this question of the inclusive, the balanced state that one wants, because the partner that the EU is looking for is a partner that is not only economically prosperous, that is defending itself successfully in the East. No, it's a comprehensive society that is developing in an inclusive way. And for us, this wider model is very important. And this is where indeed I think sometimes what the Prime Minister just called with regard to business, open and fair. I think the same words apply to the economy at the global level, to the economy here, to our interaction EU-Ukraine, and also I think for a lot of our cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. I've seen that, Mr. Maxton, you've reacted on the speech. What do you think? The war is the biggest challenge and the big risk for Ukrainian economics, or not?
Obviously, a country which has a major conflict is going to put investors, make investors nervous. So, clearly, Mr. Wagner's right. The war is an issue which we haven't discussed and is certainly a theme for business development in the country. My other response, though, to what the Prime Minister said was that he wants to be on the side of business, that he wants to privatize, that he wants to have a digital economy, and that he wants to focus on growth. And I thought, I understand why he says that, but it's a very traditional way of thinking. In the West, if you look at what happened after the Second World War, growth led to a huge level of improvement in well-being. Economic growth and well-being went up together. But in the last 30 years, that hasn't happened. We've seen economic growth, but we've actually seen the gap between rich and poor increasing. We've seen poverty in much of the world increasing. We've seen joblessness going up. The number of people without a job has gone up despite all the economic growth. And so we need to rethink this very basic narrative that we've got, this very basic idea that economic growth is always going to lead to progress, that if we're open to business, that's always going to lead to progress. We need to have a much more nuanced, balanced objective, which is to improve the standard of living of people and to do that within the bounds of nature. It's not terribly difficult. It just takes a different way of thinking to develop different economic policies which are more inclusive and more sustainable. And that, I think, was the concern I had with the speech we heard this morning.
Пане Pachauri, можливо, ви додасте?
Mr. Pachauri, maybe you'd like to add something.
Yes, I agree entirely with what's been said. And you know, the issue of war certainly is very serious and, of course, is a major challenge for a country like Ukraine. But if you were to draw a circle around, let's say, war itself, what are the things that we could do differently? What are the things that we could do better, given the fact that the situation is not really ideal? And I think that's where, if we were to ensure that the welfare of all the people can be improved through a more equitable approach, through a means by which you create decentralized employment opportunities, by which you ensure that you use your resources to the extent possible, and I'm talking specifically of energy resources, then I think with or without the war, and I hope the war situation is something that can be removed as soon as possible, because it's not in the interests of any society to continue with the current state of affairs. I think we would be able to make substantial progress in the country, because you would have a model that's more inclusive, that's more equitable, that's more sustainable. And I think these are objectives that should really define innovation. It should define the kinds of investments that we are able to attract and the policies that would ensure that we have a sustainable future. So I think, as people say sometimes, crises can also provide opportunities, and a crisis is perhaps too important an occasion to lose the opportunities that it provides. So I think this is a time for reflection, when Ukraine could do things that are totally and distinctly different from what has been pursued in other parts of the world. It's not easy, because, you know, convention is so powerful, it's very difficult to break away from it, but I think this society has the ability to do that.
Дякую вам. Пане Нефедов, у вас
Thank you, Mr. Nefedov. In your ministry, are there any original ideas discussed which, from your opinion, could give some breakthrough for Ukraine, what was already mentioned by our colleagues? Well, I do understand this narrative, which is totally new in the world, that just economic growth as it is of course necessary, but not enough, not substantial factor aspect to make the people's life better. Of course, there is the question as for the distribution of those goods, there is the question of the usage for creation of better conditions of life for the vast majority of the population, not only for the narrow group of the selected people or the people who are working in the branches which are growing super fast. And of course, Ukraine faces the same challenges. For instance, we can see that the IT sphere is having the whole gap between itself and all the rest, the middle, the average level of life in Ukraine, so it creates the world within itself. Sometimes I tell a kind of a half joke when a person who wanted to work at Prozoro, our work about e-procurement, he asked whether the Ministry of Economy has PlayStation 4 and an opportunity to play PlayStation. Yes, it is half a joke, but it shows, it demonstrates what was mentioned by the speakers before. In our opinion, The main thing for Ukraine is to provide the sustainable development of the resource base which we'll be able to use further on. Of course, I'm speaking first of all about the Ministry of Economy. We are the ministry which has to provide the work of the engine which will give the resources which could be used for some different aims and goals. And honestly speaking, all of the recipes which provide the basics, the foundation for this growth, are well known already. We need to make the economy easy, simple for the business. We have to make the country competitive in comparison of other representatives of the regions. We need to create the conditions which will provide the growth of the new sectors and new innovations when we use them, not copying someone, but giving the trend. And of course it's understandable that it's necessary but not substantial condition, but without creating those conditions it's impossible to move forward, or at least very complicated too. Whether we have any other more original or unexpected, not used ideas, not used by any other countries in the world, any models of the growth, it seems to me it's very hard to find them, especially for the country which is rather big and which can't rely upon the only idea or one branch or usage of some original advantages. So it seems to me that the way to success for us is, on the one hand, is rather trivial, but on the other hand is very simple. We need to work as much as we can. We have to increase the productivity and just to move forward, catching up the countries of Eastern Europe, which can be a wonderful example for us what can be done during the 20 years. Here in the conversation I heard for several times the topic of innovations and the word investments, so I'd like to ask Mr. Al-Shazavi, you're looking at our market, so would you please tell which directions are interesting for the investments here, and do we have the perspectives for those investments?
Well, I believe that the market is very open, competitive, and you have resources that, it's very competitive. Agricultural resources, HR resources, IT resources, which could be basically promoted very well in the FDI market. However, I would go back and just, put a foundation for investment. I think if you basically would like to build any city, you would need to make the master plan. I think it's the same thing for the economy. If you want to basically come over the challenges of the economy and you want to have a growth, economical growth, a sustainable economical growth, definitely you need a proper, two parents, or the parents, which is the government and the private sector. The government cannot work alone, and the private sector cannot work alone. And what I see basically in some countries, basically, that the government is totally away from the private sector. And I think the partnership, which is laid between the government and the private sector, is very important. The government has to basically fix the policies, the legislation, transparencies, the competitiveness level of doing business internationally. It's very important for the private sectors to attract the foreign direct investment. And that's what we have worked in United Arab Emirates, that we brought the gap very closer between the government as well as the private sector. So continuous collaboration is there between the government and private sector, because any opportunity or any initiative of the government initiative is an opportunity for the business sector. So the business cannot basically trust the market if there is no such collaboration. And this is very important for business environment as well as investment environment, that the government has to give a confidence on the market. And that's basically, we find it in Dubai. I'm sure that everybody's, been in Dubai, or most of you been in Dubai, have seen that business environment. And this is, basically because we are, as a citizen, as a business people, very close to our government. And government listen to us, and government basically adopt the policies and change the policies based on the need of the business. So the business always change, the environment change, the market overview change, and then the government has to basically change. Now, we come back to the attraction of the investment between Ukraine and the other countries, specifically I would say about the Middle East countries. I think, there's a lot of bilateral, trade could be developed. And I think there is much more potentials in terms of investment and trade that we can develop. The numbers are between $500 to $600 million in terms of trade between UAE and between Ukraine. I think the potential is more, and it needs more FDI promotion. And I think the Prime Minister has made it very clear that, he is focusing on developing the FDI's offices or investment promotion offices that basically, will attract more FDI. And I think, focusing on these people who are basically the FDI promotion agencies, and they will be the best sellers for you to attract investment. And I think you have a lot of natural resources, a lot of basically agriculture, a lot of things that, it's required in the other part of the world. So there could be, a lot of bilateral trade between our countries and your country.
Дякую, пане Maxton.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about innovation and growth. We've got into our heads the idea, I think, that innovation is about technology. It's about companies like Google and Amazon and Tesla. And to a great extent, that we don't need innovation in that technological sense at all to solve the world's problems. We don't need innovation in the energy sector. We have all the solutions to the world's energy challenges already. Where we need innovation is in our social and economic systems, particularly the economic system. The economic system, we need to ask some fundamental questions about what is the economy for? Who is it serving? What do we want to achieve with it? That's where we need innovation, and also in the way our political systems respond to the needs of the people. We need to give much more thought to that, not just to technology. And I also just want to make the point that the Club of Rome and I are not against economic growth. We can have as much economic growth as we like. We can have growth in the services sector, growth in the care sector, growth in social entrepreneurialism. We can have economic growth, but we must not increase the ecological footprint. That's the really important part. We mustn't continue to damage the environment by producing greenhouse gases, which then create climate change. And that's where we've got our thinking wrong right now. That we think we have to have economic growth, which requires more resources to be used, which creates more energy to be used, which causes greenhouse gases. So our economic growth desire is the cause of climate change. And that's what we've got to break. We can have economic growth, we can increase the amount of GDP we have, but we must not increase the amount of CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases that we produce. And that's where we've got to make the break in thinking, and that's where we need innovation.
Пане Pachauri, прошу.
Yes, mention was made about innovation and investment. And I agree entirely that you need to provide a roadmap to potential investors by which they know where they're going in, what are the kinds of things that would be favored by the government and public policy. And I would suggest two areas where that roadmap needs to be created. One is the energy sector, and the other is transport. Now, transport is one particular sector where I'm afraid the lack of policies, the lack of vision has led to enormous problems all over the world. You have problems of pollution, you have problems of congestion, you have problems of inequality. After all, mobility and transport should be available to everyone, the poorest of the poor. So you have to cater to the demand and the needs of every section of society. Now, I think this is where Ukraine has a unique opportunity to develop a roadmap. And some of us would be very happy to work with the government to see that you develop a very clear perspective of how transport and energy must develop in this country. And I think that would lead to innovation, that would lead to investments, and that hopefully will lead to a more sustainable, environmentally friendly, and climate friendly, or I would say climate change resistant kind of system that I think is absolutely essential. One last word I'd like to say is this is a country which is very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I think what we also need to do is to develop institutions and strategies by which we can adapt to those impacts of climate change, including in the case of agriculture, because you are dependent on agriculture to a large extent, and therefore the impacts of climate change are going to create serious problems and a loss of productivity in the agriculture sector. We need to find ways by which we can adapt to those impacts that are going to take place in the future. So I think some kind of road mapping is very important, by which you create a sense of confidence, direction, and assurance to investors as well as innovators on what it is that the country would like to do.
Mr. Wagner, so the energy sphere, the transport sphere, what else would you add into this roadmap for Ukraine today? Which are the key directions?
Definitively energy and transport are key. It's a huge country and there are major problems in all kinds of transport modes, in all of what we call connectivity. Another challenge really is, and that is from our perspective, normal given the size of the country, connectivity in the whole IT area. You have to allow the whole of the country to develop. There are certain hubs already, but the potential of the country is much bigger than what is currently already developed. And finally, I'm very skeptical with regard to this kind of master plan, in the sense of this will become the place where everybody will build cars or whatever. I think if you look outside, you get an idea of the variety of areas where, for example, with regard to engineering, the country is already strong. In any of these, you have to allow that the country develops. And therefore, it is so crucial what I said earlier on, to invest horizontally into an improvement of the business climate as a whole. Because wherever someone has a good idea for a new business, to do something in an innovative way, to do something differently, the people should have the opportunity to do so. And not only if you happen to live in a center that is already benefiting from the infrastructure, or if you happen to live at the border where you're close to the West. I think that is what we generally see as where Ukraine's future is. There is a variety of sectors, a variety of areas, services, agricultural, industrial products, where Ukraine can successfully, from all sides, contribute to the international competitiveness and development. And I think it's this area of the horizontal, the general development that has to be strengthened. It sounds terribly boring, but if you look outside at all these technical systems, you cannot just say, as of now, we put all our money on the aeronautics sector. You have to work in a country of this size, in the current situation, across everything. And that's, I think, where the country has an extraordinary potential. We referred to some of the problems, starting with corruption, the rule of law, the war, many of the things, and people are investing already. And many are investing successfully. Now imagine this happening in a situation where you get a substantial improvement in many of these important factors. Work is underway. Max referred to a lot of it. And that's why we are overall optimistic if the way on which Ukraine has decided to go 3 years ago is continued, that the potential is enormous. However, and that's really the final word again on this question, the inclusive society. You cannot only say we look at the business. We have to allow the people to become and remain part of that and to have this comprehensive development there. Thank you.
So we're getting to the end of our discussion. I'd like to ask each of you to use that we're having a deputy minister here, the situation, who deals with the economical development, so maybe just give him a piece of advice which you consider to be the first step which Ukrainian government should take. You heard the speech of our prime minister, so take those steps not to lose our way in this new reality and to counteract those challenges which maybe will be only strengthening. Mr. Maxton, please.
Okay, I think the main piece of advice I would give is do not just follow the economic system that has been successful in the West in the last 30 years. Think laterally. Think about a new economic system which is more inclusive. Don't assume that growth brings jobs. Don't assume that growth will reduce inequality. Don't assume that growth will reduce poverty. Don't just think that small government is necessarily good. Don't let business regulate itself. Don't think trade should be entirely open. Question all of those assumptions. Don't think that innovation should just be in the technological sector. Come up with a new economic system which is fit for the future, not one which is fit for the past.
I would repeat what I said earlier. I think this country has a unique opportunity to provide a completely innovative approach to the growth and development of transport and the energy sector. And I think it would serve even the strategic interests of Ukraine to be able to create a future where you're able to use indigenous sources of energy, to be able to use renewable sources to the extent possible, and thereby create a much higher level of security as far as energy supply is concerned. And you would also be able to tackle, therefore, the problem of pollution that is bound to continue to increase as your demand for energy goes up. And also you'd be able to become a part of the solution as far as climate change is concerned, rather than add to the problem by using conventional sources and fossil fuel sources on an increasing scale. So I would suggest these are two areas where some visionary efforts and reform are going to be extremely important.
Дякую, пане Вагнер, прошу.
With regard to Maxton and his institution he's standing for, the two areas would, in my view, be revitalize and widen what you, notably also as a person, stand for in this country and vis-à-vis the international community. Issues such as transparency, openness, the fight against corruption, this face of the modern, different Ukraine. That's the first part. So really give a new dynamics to this. And secondly, and we saw some of them and we see them in our daily work with the government, continue to reach out to all the reformers in the government, but also all the reformers which exist in many parts of the economy, and all the reformers which exist in the society as a whole. I think one has to avoid this distinction between there is an economic world, there is a financial world, there is a civil society. No, at the end of the day, it's one Ukraine for which I think the people are working and for which we are supporting them with a comprehensive reform plan.
Дякую, пане Альшазаві.
I think you should work as a private company. Brand the economy of Ukraine like a private company and utilize the best resources that you have. You have great resources in terms of IT, in terms of HR, and utilize the incentives that you have, the low cost of manpower, the low cost of doing business, and establish your innovation index. Because if you establish your innovation index, then the competitiveness levels of different areas, will go up, and then this will be a benchmark for the government employees to really, move forward in terms of improving their performance. And as my colleague said, innovation is not only in technology, innovation is in work, in manpower, in day-to-day activities, and this is where we need to focus to make the society happy, make the people happy. And if you have a happy society, happy citizen, then you will create a workplace where it will attract people to come and live and work.
Дякую, пане Нефьодов. Якими порадами ви б скористалися?
Thank you, Mr. Nefyodov. What advices would you use from what you've heard? I really liked all of the advice. I really liked the last advice. Because if we speak about the reforms on the public procurement, then what we're doing in this, either it's a private business, we are doing this reform like that. We're trying to use the methods, the management methods for the project management that are working in the private businesses and private enterprises. And I think we're the first state structure in Ukraine that works on the Scrum methodology. And we also think about the talent management as working in the private corporate. We're trying to cope the same with the innovations, and they're dealing with mistakes. And I know that this approach is not a unique one, and I hope that this approach are going to give us the possibility to reach the fantastic and awesome results that we see, for example, in Dubai for the last 50 years. We do believe in transparency, we do believe in openness. It's not just the ideological issue of us whether this open data is a good thing. We do understand that openness creates new possibilities. new opportunities. The openness gives us a possibility to be more inclusive, to engage the people into the reform, to engage the people into the procedure of state governance, the people that are going to bring new ideas, new talents, and they're going to give us the possibility to reach new results. Moreover, this history doesn't recall a country that would be very open and would have significant problems with democracy or corruption. So we do think that the best thing to cope with all of this filthiness that we don't like is to bring it into light, to give the civil society that have been mentioned by Mr. Wagner, to give the civil society the possibility to work their own way. I do agree that we do not have any specific recipes of how to do that. There's no like different list of 20 or 10 steps that we have to go. There's not sort of like checklist that is going to lead the country to prosperity. We have to remember it. We have to keep it in mind in both the state governing, both in business and the civil society sector, that the innovation temps and the changes pace, they're all be uprising. It's getting all very fast. We cannot just take this production position. We cannot copy the tutorials of like 5-6 years ago or 50-60 years ago. We cannot use one economic paradigm that has been popular or is popular nowadays. It already worked, and we think that it is going to work for Kyiv or Ukraine. It doesn't work this way. We have to run not with the speed that other countries running. We have to run faster. And for us, it means that we have to be more open. For us, it means that we have to be more transparent. We have to be more efficient. And then again, we have to do this simultaneously with all of the threats and challenges and limitations that the nature gives to us. I do agree with this. The economical growth cannot be the main aim itself. The economical growth exists in order to help improve the prosperity and welfare of the people. And I hope we'll be able to reach this. Thank you very much. So, unfortunately, we don't have the time for the questions from the audience in this panel, because we'll have the opportunity to talk to all of our speakers later in the dedicated platforms. So I think that all of the questions we have, unfortunately, I can't get very specific in many topics. But then again, I'm very grateful for the discussion. This is the first plenary section on the global challenges. This is just a general outline of the discussions that are going to be taken for the next 2 days. I hope that you will find the recipes and find the ways from the speakers that were invited to. And our guests are going to share this experience with you. All of the people are not the very frequent guests in our countries, but they have a lot to share. Right now, we would like to wrap up this the first plenary session. We have a small break, and then we'll be able to meet you at our discussion panels. Thank you.